the mystical union, and this is usually what Lutherans mean when they talk about union with Christ. Generally, it's the mystical union. So this is the most common part of union with Christ. And this is really what I dealt with in Christification. Now, this chapter was not heavily exegetical, purposefully. Some of the exegetical work was done in Christification. It'd be great, maybe someday I'll write a whole book on the, biblical theological
we were just talking about this.
background of this. I know.
I was just telling him to do it. So.
I had all these ideas when I wrote this book. I'm like, I'm going to do a chapter. I'm going to go through like Meredith Kline and how he speaks about the divine glory and like connect that with Theosis. And, yeah, like I would love to do that, but I'm like, it's just too much for this book. So maybe eventually. But
yeah, it's beyond. I mean, this is pretty long. It's pretty hefty.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah.
At some point, you have to kind of narrow your thought process.
Union with Christ is really my favorite topic. So this is something I could write only about this, and I'd be very happy. So, oh man, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so it's not like a primarily exegetical chapter, because I think what I really needed to demonstrate is that this is Lutheran. Like, I wanted to show this is in the Lutheran sources. It's in like all of the Lutheran sources. It's everywhere. It's not just in one place. It's not just one misquote of somebody. It's not just like a mistranslation. In fact, what I find interesting is some of the... So there are like three different translations. I believe three different translations of the Sacred Meditations by Johann Gerhard. And
so good.
Which
if
is
you
wonderful.
haven't read that, buy it and read it.
Yeah, and we sell a version of it.
Yes, it's delightful.
There are three different translations, and I worked with two of the English translations. One is the older one that we had, and there's Wade Johnston's, and I looked at the Latin text as well. And why I bring that up is to say that sometimes people will be like, oh, well, it's just a bad translation that wants it to say, this or that thing. I purposefully, I did this in Prolegomena too, but people didn't kind of realize what I was doing. I purposefully used a translation that was the translation of somebody who has written negative reviews of my books, specifically on Union with Christ. Because I'm like, this is a critic of my view of this, translating Gerhard. So I think it is even more powerful to say, like, even they have to recognize what he says, which is that he speaks about us becoming divine, like numerous times in that book. Mm-hmm. He says that we partake of the divine in the Eucharist, and through that we become divine. And that kind of language of divinization, becoming divine, like that is theosis, like that's definitional theosis. And I would, of course, just say, like, that's just Peter, right? Peter says we partake of the divine nature. So the question should never be for a Christian, is theosis real or not? But what is theosis? What kind of theosis is true? It's like, to say that there's no theosis is kind of like saying, well, do you believe in predestination or not? Well, I hope you do, because it's biblical, like the terms right. in the Bible. So, like, no, we share in the divine nature. Like, that, there should be no debate there. That's theosis, is sharing in the divine nature. So the question is, if there's this divinization, what is it? Okay, that's the question. Not is it real or not, but what is it? So Gerhard commonly uses this kind of language in the Sacred Meditations. And then I go through... I talk about Johann Arndt, who I know was a bit of a controversial figure, but Union is really the center of his devotional work. He was he mentored Gerhard. So he was a big influence on Gerhard. And I dealt with Arndt, and I know people are going to probably cite that and say, oh, you're just... but the pietists loved Arndt, and this is proof that you're a pietist because you cite him. Well, I know he's controversial, but he also is like the most significant figure in terms of Lutheran devotional writing. So you got to look at what he says. You can disagree with him, but know that this is common parlance among those who are like the most popular Lutheran devotional work at the time of orthodoxy. But then I also show, it's not just in Arndt and Gerhard, these devotional writers. I then, go through some of the scholastics and just talk about what is the mystical union? Like, what does this mean? They speak of partaking of the divine life. They speak about the interpenetration of natures. I deal with Hollatz. I deal with Heinecke, who's a 19th century Wells theologian. I deal with Heinrich Schmid. I deal with Conrad Lindbergh. I mean, there are names from across the centuries. And eventually I get to C.F.W. Walther. And
Gotta love Walther.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I've got plenty to complain about with Walther, but don't we all, right? I can complain about Walther's ecclesiology all day, but we'll leave that alone. Anyway, his sermons. I looked at some of his sermons, and particularly I was looking at sermons that dealt with this question of union with Christ. And I think Walther's such a significant figure because if there's anyone who was very clearly uncompromising in their confessionalism, it's Walther, right? I mean, he is so ready to cut off fellowship with anyone who disagrees on any point of an interpretation of anything.
Yes.
Like, that's just Walther. That he's very, I mean, he's like the doctrinally strict.
It's a little spicy.
He is a little spicy. He's a little, yeah. That's just Walther. Like,
yeah.
That's, I don't know if he'd be the nicest guy to hang out with, but at least maybe if you agree with him on everything. But but the point is, like, he's very hard-headed. He's, of course I love Walther, and he's got wonderful pastoral insight and theological insight. But we're picking on him a little bit, but
it's out of love. So
he's not the kind of guy going to be like, oh, he's just a crypto Eastern Orthodox dude. No, but if you read his sermons, he preaches this. Like, he preaches union. And it's not a side comment, right? It's not just like, oh, by the way, we affirm it, but whatever. Like, he preaches entire sermons on union with Christ. And he preaches about the renewal of the Imago Dei that the Spirit brings about in us, changing us, making us more like him. And he, will say things like, God became man that man might become like God. Multiple times he uses these kinds of phrases, which is, of course, like coming from Athanasius. He doesn't anywhere say, like, oh, this is Athanasius. And he doesn't, say it in exactly the same way. But the point is, the same idea is there. Like, at another point he says, he made us, God's Son became a man that we might become sons of God. He uses that. So clearly, like, this is what we mean by theosis. This is what Athanasius meant. And he spoke about this, the indwelling that changes us. And, we're talking here about the guy who wrote the book on law and gospel, right? This is not a compromiser, confuser of law and gospel. Anyway, the point of all this is just to say the mystical union has been a key part of Lutheran theology, and it always has been. And if you go from, pre-Luther, go to the Theologia Germanica and Johann Tauler and Bernard of Clairvaux, the biggest influences on Luther, like, their theology is all union with Christ. And then go to Luther and read what he says in light of all of his influences, and it's very obvious. And then read everyone following after Luther in the scholastic tradition. And yes, the Pietists, they also talk about union with Christ, but they didn't get it from nowhere. And then going into the confessional revival of the 19th century, into the beginning of the 20th century, all the way to 1930 when you hit Joseph Stump's The Christian Faith, which is a wonderful section on union with Christ, the mystical union. Which is kind of the last great book of that era, of the revival of confessionalism. Then you have a lot of other theological influences kind of taking control. You have neo-orthodoxy and all sorts of other things, and all of a sudden, union with Christ is lost. So what do you want to do? Stick with a bunch of 20th century liberal theologians, or like the rest of the Christian tradition?